Imagine the hills of Tuscany.
Rolling fields, olive groves swaying in the breeze, and narrow country roads winding toward Florence, the Renaissance jewel of Italy. It's a place of art, of beauty, of history. A place where lovers escape into the countryside, seeking privacy under the stars. But beauty can hide something darker. And on certain nights, the quiet Tuscan air carried not the sound of cicadas, but the echo of gunfire. This is where our story begins. It is August 21st, 1968. A warm summer evening. A young couple, Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci, decide to spend the night together in Antonio's car. They drive into the countryside outside Florence, searching for solitude. For them, the car is a world of their own. They believe no one can see them. But someone does. At around midnight, a shadow emerges from the darkness. The attacker carries a small pistol, a .22 caliber Beretta. With chilling precision, he fires into the car, killing Antonio instantly. Barbara is shot next. When the bodies are found, investigators note the brutality. The killer didn't steal anything. He didn't attempt to cover his tracks. He simply killed and vanished. At the time, police treat it as an isolated crime, perhaps jealousy or a crime of passion. Nobody suspects that this is the opening chapter of a nightmare that will haunt Florence for nearly 2 decades. The calm before the storm. The case grows cold, but the gun, that Beretta .22, remains silent only for a time. And while Florence enjoys its beauty, its wine, its art, the monster waits. When telling stories of true horror, we often imagine shadows lurking in alleyways, or killers stalking their victims in crowded cities. But in Florence, the terror grew in the most intimate of places. Between lovers, hidden away in cars, surrounded by fields and forests. It is here, in the stillness of night, that the monster of Florence would strike again. The hills of Tuscany kept their secrets well. For years after the murders of Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci in 1968, life in Florence moved on. The case faded into the background. People whispered about it. Yes, but most dismissed it as a crime of jealousy, a one-time tragedy. But the shadow of the monster had not vanished. It was only waiting. 1974. The pattern begins. 6 years later, in 1974, another couple drives into the quiet countryside. This time, it is Stefania Pettini and Pasquale Gentilcore, both young, both seeking a private night away from prying eyes. They park on a dirt road, hidden by trees, certain that they are alone. But once again, the silence of the Tuscan night is broken by gunfire. The killer approaches with the same .22 Beretta pistol. Pasquale is shot and killed instantly. Stefania is shot, then mutilated with a knife. She is left in a horrifying state, a scene that shocks investigators and hints at a ritualistic cruelty. This is no ordinary murderer. This is someone who kills not for money, not for jealousy, but for something far darker. The press covers the killings briefly, but the connection to the 1968 murders is not yet made. For most, it is another tragedy in the countryside. But for those who paid close attention, a chilling detail remained, the same type of gun, the Beretta 22. 1981. The monster returns. The killer goes quiet for 7 long years. 7 years in which Florence sleeps, unaware that the nightmare is only gathering strength. Then, in 1981, the monster strikes again. Another couple, Carmela Danuccio and Giovanni Foggi, are attacked in their car. The gunfire is fast and merciless. As before, the victims are mutilated. This time, the brutality is undeniable. And when police compare ballistics, they realize the horrifying truth. The same weapon has now been used in multiple murders, stretching back over a decade. Florence has a serial killer. fear spreads. The press explodes with headlines. Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence, becomes the name whispered in cafes, in schools, in hushed voices at dinner tables. Couples stop going into the countryside at night. Parents warn their children. Police patrols increase, but it feels useless. The killer is always one step ahead. What makes this terror worse is the randomness. There is no clear motive, no connection between the victims. The monster targets young couples, lovers seeking privacy. Anyone could be next. The very act of romance, of love, becomes dangerous. Florence, the city of Michelangelo and Dante, a city built on passion and art, now finds passion transformed into fear. 1982. The violence escalates. On June 19, 1982, tragedy strikes again. A German couple, Horst Meyer and Uwe Rusch, are camping near Florence. The killer approaches, and once again, the Beretta 22 speaks. But this time, the victims are men. At first, investigators wonder if the killer has changed his pattern. Later, theories suggest he may have mistaken one of the men for a woman in the darkness. Whatever the truth, the murders fuel the growing panic. Later that year, in September 1982, another couple is killed, Susanna Cambi and Stefano Baldi. They are found shot and stabbed in their car. Susanna's body is mutilated. The ritualistic element is undeniable now. The killer is not just murdering, he is performing. Each crime scene feels staged, deliberate, as though the killer is reliving something, or feeding some dark compulsion. 1983. The monster tightens his grip. By 1983, Florence lives in fear. Young couples dare not drive into the countryside. Police patrols roam the hills, but the monster seems invisible. He kills quickly, vanishes silently, and leaves behind only horror. In September 1983, the killer strikes again. A young couple, German tourists Jens-Uwe Rusch and Horst Meyer. Wait, correction. These were 1982. In 1983, it was Wilhelm Friedrich Geisler and Jens-Uwe Rusch. Investigators are baffled by the consistency. Always lovers, always at night, always the same weapon, the same mutilations. The media frenzy becomes unbearable. Journalists descend on Florence, spinning theories of satanic rituals, secret cults, and madmen roaming the countryside. The psychology of fear. What makes this chapter of the story so terrifying is not only the killings themselves, but their effect on the people of Florence. Couples who once strolled freely under the stars now fear the night. Lovers' lanes, once filled with cars and whispers, are abandoned. Imagine being a young couple, sitting in your car, headlights off, sharing a kiss. Then, the sudden terror of imagining a shadow watching you from the trees. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf becomes a threat. The monster had not only killed, he had stolen the city's innocence. By the early 1980s, the Monster of Florence was no longer just a criminal. He was a phantom, a legend, a terror that seeped into every household. But the worst was yet to come. Because between 1981 and 1985, the killings would escalate into a reign of terror that shook Italy to its core. By the mid-1980s, Florence was no longer just a city of art and beauty. It was a city under siege, and the enemy was invisible. The people had given him a name, Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. He was not a ghost story, not a legend. He was real. And for couples in love, he was death waiting in the shadows. 1981 to 1985, a string of murders. The period between 1981 and 1985 became the darkest chapter of the case. During these years, the killings were relentless. Each summer, like clockwork, another couple would fall victim. Investigators began to map the murders. They formed a pattern. Couples, isolated cars, secluded roads, and always the same weapon, the Beretta .22 caliber pistol. And then, the knife. Always the knife. The gunshots were swift, efficient. But what came after was ritualistic, brutal. The female victims were mutilated in ways so grotesque that even hardened detectives were shaken. It was no longer just murder, it was obsession. 1981, Giovanni and Carmela. On June 6, 1981, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio were parked in their car near Scandicci, just outside Florence. The attack was fast. Giovanni was shot dead instantly. Carmela was shot, then dragged from the car and mutilated. When police arrived, they were horrified at the violence, and at the realization that this crime was not isolated. Ballistic testing confirmed it. This was the same Beretta pistol used in the 1968 and 1974 murders. The monster was back. 1982, 2 strikes. In June 1982, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini were attacked. Paolo, wounded but still alive, tried to start the car and drive away. The killer fired again, stopping him. Both were left dead. What disturbed police most was the escalation. The killer was adapting. He was patient, waiting for his moment, and merciless when he struck. Then, in September 1982, another couple, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, both shot, both stabbed, both mutilated. Florence was gripped with terror. The monster was no longer a distant rumor. He was here now, killing again and again. 1983. The horror spreads. In September 1983, German tourists Horst Meyer and Uwe Rusch became victims. Their campsite was turned into a crime scene. This killing terrified locals even more. The victims weren't Italian. This meant the monster wasn't just preying on locals, but anyone who came into his territory. Tourists, too, were no longer safe. By now, Florence had transformed. Lovers' lanes, once alive with youth, were empty. Patrol cars roamed the countryside, yet the monster always seemed to slip away. Every summer, it felt inevitable. Another couple, another killing, another headline. 1984. Pia and Claudio. On July 29, 1984, Pia Rontini and Claudio Stefanacci parked their car in the countryside. The monster struck again. Both were killed. Pia's body was mutilated in the same ritualistic manner. The brutality was escalating, and so was the fear. Florence's newspapers filled their front pages with the killings. Rumors spread of satanic cults, of hunters hiding in the woods, of rituals in the hills. Parents warned their children never to go out alone. By this point, the monster was not just a killer. He was a spectre that haunted the imagination. 1985. The Last Murders. On September 8, 1985, the nightmare reached its crescendo. A young couple, Jean-Michel Kravechvili and Nadine Morio, were camping near Florence. In the middle of the night, the monster attacked. Jean-Michel was killed instantly. Nadine tried to run, but she was chased down and murdered. It was the same weapon, the same ritual, the same horror. This would be the last confirmed killing of the Monster of Florence. But in 1985, the people of Tuscany did not know it was over. They waited for the next headline, the next body, the next summer night of horror. The city under siege. To understand the atmosphere of Florence during these years, you must imagine living with constant dread. Imagine you are a young man driving with your girlfriend. Do you dare pull over on a quiet road? Do you even risk a moment of privacy? Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch becomes a threat. Shadows move where nothing should move. Headlights in the distance bring panic. Is it just another couple? Or is it him? The monster didn't just kill his victims. He killed the city's sense of safety. The investigation in chaos. As the murders continued, police were desperate. Thousands of hours of manpower were poured into the case. Dozens of suspects were arrested, questioned, released. Psychologists painted portraits of the killer, a sexually frustrated man, a loner, someone obsessed with women. But every lead led to nothing. The killer was invisible, and the public grew restless. Some began to believe the police were covering something up. Others whispered of powerful men protecting the real murderer. And so, Florence lived in fear and doubt, its nights poisoned by the shadow of the monster. By 1985, the monster had claimed at least 16 lives. His reign of terror had lasted nearly 2 decades. But eventually, the killings stopped. And when the silence returned, investigators were left with a terrifying question. Had the monster gone into hiding? Or was he still out there, watching, waiting? It would take nearly a decade before suspicion finally fell on a man named Pietro Pacciani. By the mid-1980s, the killings had stopped, but the terror remained. Florence held its breath. For almost 20 years, couples had been murdered in their cars, cut down in moments of intimacy, and mutilated in ways too grotesque to describe. Then suddenly, silence. But silence is not comfort. Silence is not safety. For Florence, silence was the sound of a predator retreating into the shadows, watching, waiting for the right time to strike again. The pressure on police. The authorities were desperate. Politicians demanded results. The public demanded justice. Over the years, police had chased hundreds of leads. They arrested suspects, interrogated them, and then released them when evidence fell apart. Psychics were consulted. Journalists published theories of satanic cults and ritual murders. Some investigators even began to believe there was not just one killer, but a network, a group of men sharing a sick obsession. And through it all, the city lived in fear. Imagine reading the headlines every summer, waiting for the next couple to be slaughtered. Imagine kissing someone you love while wondering if headlights would appear in the rearview mirror, belonging not to another car, but to a monster with a gun. Florence was a city poisoned by dread. The suspects. Over the years, several men fell under suspicion. Some were loners. Some had criminal pasts. Some simply lived near the crime scenes. But none of them fit. None of them had the history, the brutality, or the sheer capacity for violence that matched the monster. Until the 1990s, when investigators looked at a man named Pietro Pacciani. Pietro Pacciani. Pietro Pacciani was not a stranger to violence. Born in 1925, he grew up in rural Tuscany, working as a farmer. But behind his rugged exterior was a temper that often erupted into rage. In 1951, Pacciani murdered a man, the lover of his girlfriend. Not only did he kill him, but he stabbed the man 20 times and desecrated the body. He served 13 years in prison before being released. Later, he was accused of abusing his wife and daughters. His reputation in the community was one of violence, cruelty, and perversion. So when police began reviewing potential suspects in the early 1990s, Pacciani's name stood out. The evidence against him. Investigators raided Pacciani's home. What they found disturbed them. Pornographic magazines, knives, strange objects that hinted at obsessions far from ordinary. But more chilling was the connection between Pacciani and the crime scenes. Witnesses recalled seeing him in the areas where couples were killed. Some claimed he had knowledge of the murders that no ordinary person could know. And though no smoking gun was ever found, no Beretta pistol, no direct evidence, prosecutors believed they finally had their monster. The arrest. In 1993, Pietro Pacciani was arrested. The city erupted in shock. Some felt relief, believing the monster had finally been caught. Others doubted. Pacciani denied everything. He said he was no monster, no killer, but his past, the murder, the abuse, the violence, painted a very different picture. The trial became a media circus. The courtroom was packed with journalists. Italians watched with horror and fascination as prosecutors laid out the case. Pietro Pacciani was the Monster of Florence. The conviction. In 1994, after a grueling trial, Pacciani was convicted of multiple murders linked to the Monster of Florence. He was sentenced to life in prison. For the first time in decades, Florence breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed the nightmare was finally over. The monster had a face, a name, and a cell to contain him. But the story did not end there. Doubts and shadows. Almost immediately, questions arose. Some investigators felt the evidence was circumstantial. Ballistics proved the same gun was used, yes, but it had never been found in Pacciani's possession. Others argued the killings required more than one man, a lookout, an accomplice, someone to help carry out such precise, staged crimes. And soon, new witnesses emerged, pointing not just to Pacciani, but to a group of men. A so-called circle of accomplices. Pietro Pacciani's conviction should have closed the book on the Monster of Florence, but instead, it opened a darker, more complex chapter. Because if Pacciani was guilty, he was not guilty alone. And if he was innocent, then the true Monster of Florence was still out there. The investigation was about to take a shocking turn, into a world of accomplices, conspiracies, and a death that left the truth forever uncertain. By the mid-1990s, it seemed as if Florence finally had its monster. Pietro Pacciani sat behind bars, convicted of the brutal murders that had haunted the city for nearly 20 years. The people wanted closure. The authorities wanted to declare victory. But the shadows weren't finished. The truth was more tangled, more sinister than anyone had imagined. The overturned conviction. In 1996, just 2 years after Pacciani's conviction, an appeals court overturned the verdict. Why? Because doubts had grown too heavy. The evidence, critics argued, was thin, circumstantial at best. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no physical proof tying Pacciani to the crime scenes. The only thing that made Pacciani a convincing suspect was his violent past, and perhaps his reputation as a brute. Was this justice or desperation? The retrial was set, but before it could begin, something unexpected happened. Pacciani's death. In 1998, Pietro Pacciani was found dead in his home. The official story, he had suffered a heart attack, but others weren't so sure. Some whispered that he had been silenced, that powerful people, perhaps even those tied to the killings, didn't want him to speak. His death left the case in limbo. The supposed Monster of Florence had gone to the grave, taking his secrets with him, but the story wasn't over. The accomplices, Vanni and Lotti. With Pacciani dead, investigators turned to 2 of his acquaintances, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti. Both were older men, simple, unrefined, sometimes referred to by locals as village idiots. Yet prosecutors claimed they had been accomplices in the killings. According to testimony, Vanni and Lotti sometimes joined Pacciani on his murderous hunts. They acted as lookouts, helpers, or even participants. Lotti, under questioning, eventually confessed, though his story shifted constantly, full of contradictions. Still, his words were enough to push the case forward. The trials. The trials of Vanni and Lotti became another media spectacle. Journalists filled the courtrooms. Italians debated in cafes and on television. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. A group of men, bound by perversion, stalking young lovers in the countryside. The murders were not just random acts, but ritualistic killings, possibly even part of a larger hidden network. In 1997, both Vanni and Lotti were convicted. They were sentenced to life in prison. For the authorities, this was victory. For the public, it was closure. The Monster of Florence was not just one man. It was a circle of men, predators who had worked together in secrecy. Doubts remain. And yet, doubt lingered. Lotti's testimony was shaky, inconsistent. He was described by some as mentally fragile, easily manipulated, not fully aware of what he was saying. Some criminologists argued the crimes were too precise, too calculated, to have been carried out by men like Vanni and Lotti. Theories emerged that perhaps Pacciani, Vanni, and Lotti were scapegoats, convenient figures who could be blamed to satisfy public outrage. Other theories went deeper, that the killings were connected to powerful figures in Florence, that the crimes had ritualistic or even occult motives, and that the true architects had never faced justice. The case declared solved. Officially, the Monster of Florence case was closed. The courts declared it solved. Pacciani was the primary killer, aided by Vanni and Lotti. But in the court of public opinion, the case remained alive. Books were written, journalists dug for answers, and investigators continued to whisper in the shadows. Even today, decades later, some argue that the real monster was never caught, that the men convicted were pawns in a much larger, darker game. The haunting legacy. What cannot be denied is the terror the monster brought to Florence. For nearly 2 decades, couples feared to love in the open. The hills and fields of Tuscany, once places of romance, became hunting grounds. At least 16 people lost their lives. Countless more lost their sense of safety, their innocence, their trust in the night. And though the courts delivered their verdict, the legend remains unresolved. So who was the Monster of Florence? Was it Pietro Pacciani, the violent farmer with a murderous past? Was it a circle of accomplices, men who prowled the countryside together, driven by lust and cruelty? Or was it something even darker, a network hidden in the shadows of Florence, too powerful to expose? The truth may never be known. What is certain is this. For nearly 20 years, the Monster of Florence haunted the lovers of Tuscany. He turned intimacy into terror, romance into death, and beauty into horror. And even now, decades later, when the Tuscan wind blows across the fields at night, some say the monster still lingers, watching, waiting in the shadows.